Britain's been basking in the heatwave again. In many parts of the country, it's been hotter than Hong Kong or Honolulu.
It's currently June 2026, and we are on the back of the latest record-breaking heatwave. And what every single one of these now, multiple annual heat waves tells us is that this is something we need to get used to. And yes, if you're wondering, I know it doesn't look like I'm in a heat wave. It's because I've chosen the only day of the June heat wave to film when it's actually been raining for most of the morning. But hey, what it is doing is making it a lot more pleasant to film this. But with every new heat wave, you still get a certain generation still telling you that it's not as bad as the 1976 heat wave. So I'm here at the River Drought to find out just how bad that 1976 heat wave was. And how did it stack up to today's record-breaking heat waves? Every single summer we have now seems to come with the same warning. Yet more heat waves, more droughts, more pleas from water companies to use less water, roads and critical infrastructure softening beneath the hot summer sun, wildfires breaking out across the country. In fact, there was a wildfire just down the road from my house only 2 years ago. Firefighters pushed to their limits, hospitals pushed to their limits, everyone pushed to their limit. And every single year, the same question gets asked: is this Britain's hottest summer? But for millions of people of a certain generation, there is only one summer that is repeatedly described as Britain's hottest: 1976. Mention that year to pretty much anyone who's there, and all they can think of are ice cream vans doing record business, children playing in dried up streams, gardens transforming from green to brown, and above all, weeks and weeks with no rain. Something that pretty much used to be unheard of in this country. Or at the very least, was very, very rare. Now for some, obviously, this was the perfect summer, but for a lot of people, beneath the beautiful blue skies and sweltering Mediterranean temperatures, reservoirs were emptying. Farmers were seeing their crops wilt and die in their fields. Entire rivers critical to local wildlife and ecosystems were disappearing. And people queued in the streets to collect water from standpipes because they had no water at home. And now, 50 years later, Britain is once again experiencing incredible hot summers, long dry spells, and increased pressure on water supplies. So, what actually happened and why? And was 1976 in any way comparable to what we're seeing now every single year? Now, most people remember 1976 because of just the sheer endless heat. But in reality, this massively impactful heat wave came about because of the absence of rain. Weather records showed that most of Britain experienced an incredibly unusual dry spell throughout the latter half of 1975, and autumn rainfall was way below average across many regions. And by the time winter arrived, groundwater reserves, which normally replenish during the colder winter months, had failed to recover. Now this, as we well know now, is hugely important to Britain's water supply because it depends on far more than full reservoirs. All that rain falling during the autumn and the winter slowly soaks into the ground, replenishes aquifers, feeds rivers, and restores reservoirs before the following summer can begin. It's essentially our wet savings account. And after this incredibly dry spell at the end of 1975, by the beginning of 1976, that savings account was running incredibly low. Instead of the usual prolonged Atlantic storms sweeping in from the west, much of the country was experiencing a very long settled spell. Rainfall throughout was continually disappointing, and spring followed the exact same pattern. Then March, then April, then May. Each month for the first part of the year passed with a very, very below average amount of rainfall across large parts of England and Wales. But up until this point, most people didn't really see this as anything remarkable. There was no national emergency declared. There were no newspaper panics. Because of course Britain had had dry springs from time to time before. But what most people couldn't see was that reservoir levels were falling. Groundwater levels were continuously declining. Rivers were getting weaker and weaker. And there were warning signs, but almost nobody had noticed. The 1976 heatwave was a perfect example of how a heatwave doesn't necessarily turn into a drought
when you start to see the rivers drying up, when you start to see the grass turning brown. The drought side of things starts much, much earlier. And it's before you start to see those visible signs of what we'd consider to be drought that things are starting to get really bad.
Meteorologists now understand that the drought was the product of a stubborn and unusually persistent pattern of atmospheric pressure. I'm not going to pretend to really understand that, but that's what it was. And normally, and I can vouch for this, weather systems arriving from the Atlantic usually brought regular bands of rain across the British Isles. But during the first half of 1976, a large area of high pressure repeatedly became established across Western Europe, almost like an invisible shield batting away that rain. And every single one of those Atlantic weather systems was diverted north. And day after day, the sunshine continued to dominate. Now, initially, people reacted how you'd imagine and just celebrated the nice dry weather.
I mean, most of you watching know what the British are like when the sun comes out. For certain people, it's shirt off, down the pub, down the beach, down to any nearby water source you can find. And you can't really blame people for not really thinking about the bigger picture and just enjoying themselves. But bubbling below the surface, or should we say drying out below the surface, things were looking far more sinister.
I mean, even I'm old enough to expect summer to last no longer than like a few good days, maybe a solid good week of weather each year before the rain comes back. But in 1976, few imagined that those weather patterns bringing pleasant spring afternoons would help create one of the greatest environmental crises in modern British history. By around June, the countryside was already changing. Fields were beginning to lose their colour, gardeners were noticing that lawns required constant watering, and streams were getting shallower and shallower, and farmers were seriously starting to worry about their low yields. But warnings remained largely confined to agricultural journals and local reports, and the public had little reason to be concerned. Then, towards the end of June, the conditions changed again. That same high-pressure system that had delivered months of dry weather now began drawing exceptionally warm air northwards. Britain wasn't just drying out, it was also about to become hot. Very hot. Newspapers celebrated the sunshine, holiday resorts filled with visitors, ice cream sales of course exploded, and at first it felt like the perfect British summer.
People treated it like any nice summer, you know. People were like, my God, glorious weather, let's go to the beach, let's go for a swim. Basically, for the most part, people lived a very, very enjoyable summer.
Nobody had yet realised that every single cloudless day that passed was bringing the country one step closer to a national emergency. Because the great danger of the summer of 1976 wasn't just the heat, it was what that heat was slowly taking away.
Now, I know for a fact that most of my audience were probably alive back in 1976. Let's just say my audience skews 60 plus. So if you have any memories of the 1976 heatwave, anything you'd like to share, then let me know in the comments, because it'd be fascinating to read some of your experiences and your memories from back then. It is interesting as well seeing what people have to say about the 76 heatwave. None of it is, you know, full of foreboding or, you know, it was terrible, terrible. It was really kind of like, oh yeah, it was a bit of fun. It was a different summer. We got to spend a lot of time in swimming pools and at the beach. But I think it'd be interesting to go back to the time, see people sat in offices, sweating profusely, sat in classrooms, barely able to concentrate any more than they would usually be able to concentrate. People desperately fighting over water fountains. Probably very easy to look back at it with rose-tinted glasses now.
Now, as might usually happen during the British summer, at least as it used to be, the heat back in 1976 wasn't arriving in isolated bursts, you know, a weekend of exceptional heat and then back to kind of normal. It got hot and then it simply stayed hot. Now, normally Britain's weather kind of changes every few days, it's constantly up and down. Atlantic depressions roll in, rain falls, cooler air follows, and then the cycle begins again. But in the summer of 1976, that cycle broke down. An enormous area of high pressure became locked across Western Europe. Meteorologists call this a blocking anticyclone, which means instead of allowing Atlantic weather systems to cross Britain, the high pressure system forces them away. And that's what continued to happen week after week. The rain simply couldn't get through. Cloud formation was suppressed, skies remained almost permanently clear, and sunlight poured down uninterrupted. Each day became slightly hotter than the last. Each day, the ground got slightly drier. Each day, more moisture evaporated from Britain's rivers, lakes, and reservoirs. The hot weather wasn't just unusual, it was trapped where it was. And almost immediately, records started to be beaten. On the 28th of June, Southampton reached 35.6 degrees Celsius. At the time, that was the highest June temperature ever officially recorded in the United Kingdom. Then, just 5 days later, on the 3rd of July, Cheltenham became even hotter. The thermometer reached 35.9 degrees Celsius, another national record. But the most remarkable statistic wasn't just these records falling, it was the consistency. And in some parts of England, the temperature exceeded 32 degrees Celsius for 15 consecutive days. At Heathrow Airport, the temperature topped 30 degrees for 16 successive days. Even by today's figures, that's extraordinary. Now, at first, people embraced it, of course, but away from the beaches and the holiday resorts, the mood was becoming very different. Farmers were among the first to realise that something was incredibly wrong. Crops were failing, livestock was struggling to graze. Experts at the time recorded that the top 12 inches of soil in Britain had completely dried out. And in some areas, farmers were forced to begin feeding winter supplies months early. Water for those animals was becoming increasingly difficult to find, and the drought was no longer an inconvenience. It had become an economic crisis. Across southern and eastern England, wheat yields began to fail. Vegetables withered, fruit harvests suffered, and agricultural losses were starting to tot up towards hundreds of millions of pounds. But the countryside wasn't the only place beginning to suffer. Lawns were beginning to disappear, public parks were turning yellow, trees began shedding their leaves in the middle of summer. And of course, wildlife began behaving differently too. Birds were struggling to find water, fish were becoming trapped in the shrinking rivers. And then came another completely unexpected consequence. Ladybirds. Millions upon millions of ladybirds. The hot, dry weather had created ideal breeding conditions for aphids, and so ladybird populations exploded in response because ladybirds love aphids. But as the weeks dragged on, the aphid population started to go very, very quickly downhill, meaning less food for the ladybirds, which meant all of a sudden Britain had huge swarms of millions of ladybirds desperately looking for food. They covered beaches, cars, people.
I've seen anecdotes from people talking about playing games where they'd scoop up ladybirds in little jars and see who could get the most in a jar. That's how many there were. There were thousands, millions, just swarming everywhere. I even heard stories about people heading to certain places, then having to basically divert because entire towns were just overrun.
By now, meteorologists were becoming increasingly concerned, not just because of how hot it was, but because there was still no sign of any meaningful rain. Every weather forecast as far forward as it could go looked almost identical. High pressure, blue skies, temperatures climbing, again and again and again. Reservoirs continued to see levels fall day after day. River authorities began preparing emergency plans, and government departments had to start quietly discussing what might happen and what they could do if the drought continued into autumn. Because of course, someone, somewhere, if governments are doing their due diligence, had to be asking, what happens if the rain we need never comes? By the end of July, the illusion of this glorious, endless summer was beginning to fade. For weeks, people had been celebrating the sunshine. The country was quietly running out of water. Not just in the reservoirs, not just in the rivers, but in the ground itself. And that question of when it was finally going to rain was being asked more and more. Across England, streams started to disappear. Rivers were suffering incredibly. Normally being fed by groundwater and regular rainfall, many had simply stopped flowing. Sections of the River Lee, the River Colne, the River Drought, and many smaller waterways were starting to dry up altogether.
It is incredible to think of rivers like the Drought behind me completely running dry. I mean, these are rivers that villages are built around, critical infrastructure relies upon. You just kind of take for granted that they'll always be there. And so you can imagine how alarming, probably, you know, exciting and different at first, but alarming it was when rivers like this just started to run dry. What's incredible as well is places like Lady Bower Reservoir started to basically evaporate. And what they revealed were things like the hidden villages that were flooded to make the reservoir in the first place. At Haweswater in the Lake District, the valley floor that had been flooded for years was suddenly revealed again. People could walk on river and lake beds that had been underwater for decades and even centuries. It does make you wonder what incredible things you discover if all the rivers and lakes dried up today in 2026. You can picture it now. Laughing gas canisters, syringes, knives. Such wonderful secrets being kept hidden by the country's waterways.
And of course, this lack of water made another form of disaster all the more likely: fire. The dry vegetation now covering most of Britain's countryside had become the perfect fuel. Across southern England, grass fires became increasingly common. Forest, heathland, and farmland all went up with alarming speed. One of the largest fires occurred at Herne Forest down in Dorset, where around 50,000 trees were destroyed. And fire brigades, of course, found themselves tackling blazes more commonly associated with Mediterranean countries or places like Australia than what should be expected in southern England.
Now, if there's any firefighters out there, maybe you can tell me, but I can imagine that every time another heatwave comes around, you probably start feeling a little bit nervous, a little bit apprehensive, because you know what's coming. And where most people see more trips to the beach, you're probably seeing a lot more work coming your way.
And every passing week was increasing the risk of more of these incredibly dangerous fires. On the 30th of June alone, fire brigades across Suffolk, Norfolk and Essex answered about one emergency call every 3 minutes. And the Suffolk Fire Service actually received 619 calls in a single day. At a place called Little Cornard, around 60 acres of woodland were destroyed, with around 50 firefighters there desperately trying to battle it. And for July in total, the Suffolk Fire Service estimated that around 900 acres of crops had been destroyed, with losses estimated at around £100,000, or almost £700,000 in today's money. And as things continued and the government continued to get more and more concerned, on the 6th of August 1976, Parliament passed the Drought Act. This legislation granted water authorities incredible temporary powers. They could restrict water use, control supplies, abstract additional water from rivers where possible, and take emergency action to protect the essential services. The Act was moved through Parliament with, of course, unusual speed, because simply the country couldn't afford to wait. And for many people who'd perhaps not been worrying about it as much, the drought became real when standpipes appeared. In the areas that were experiencing the greatest pressure on supplies, normal water use became just impossible. And this, of course, led to residents queuing with buckets, or watering cans, or any container they could find. Anything that they could use to collect enough water from those standpipes for cooking and cleaning. This meant that in rural areas there was one standpipe to be used between 40 households, and in towns, one standpipe per 100 homes. For the older generation, it was reminiscent of wartime rationing. And of course, for Britain, a country famous for how wet it can get, the symbolism of people queuing for water was hard to ignore. And as emergency powers were brought in by the government, across the country people started to finally ask, how much water do we have left?
You've got to remember as well the different circumstances, the different world in which this heatwave was taking place. There's not a lot of air conditioning now unless you're going to go somewhere in your car or into a supermarket. Back then, there was far less air conditioning, like basically none. And so even getting into your car to go for a drive, there was just no respite from the heat.
By late August, it had been almost 3 months of endless heat and not enough rain. And by this point, the government had taken yet another extraordinary measure in appointing Cabinet Minister Dennis Howe as the Minister of Drought, whose chief responsibility was overseeing drought policy. That's how extreme things had gotten. And guess what? Almost immediately afterwards, in fact, just a few days afterwards, it came.
Storms are exciting, like I still get excited when a huge thunderstorm rolls past. But you can imagine that those first thunderstorms that arrived and brought the rain with them were probably even more exciting than usual. And from what I've read, it seems like people celebrated, the coming of the rains with the kind of jubilance and excitement that you'd expect from, medieval peasants.
Cartoonist drew Howe dragging rain clouds over Britain. One headline joked that he should immediately be appointed Minister of Floods instead.
Now, of course, the drought didn't end overnight. It was going to take a lot more rain than that. But it was the beginning of the end. The spell had been broken.
Behind the good humour and the fact that the rains had finally come, it couldn't be ignored that this incredible drought had exposed something very, very significant. Britain's key water infrastructure, long designed around the assumption that there would just be plentiful rainfall all the time, was far more vulnerable than anyone had realised. And even after the rain came, the effects of the drought lingered long after. Some woodlands suffered lasting damage that could still be seen decades later. Young trees that had been weakened by months of no water at all died during following winters. And scientists would actually go on to later identify the 1976 heatwave as one of the defining environmental events of 20th century Britain. In fact, hydrologists still use it as the benchmark against which severe droughts are measured today. Emergency planning had to be reviewed, management of reservoirs was adapted, environmental monitoring had to be improved. If anything, the summer of 1976 became, something of a warning for what we're experiencing now today.
Now, of course, as with every heatwave, the impact on health can't be ignored. And for the 1976 heatwave, they recorded an excess of 20% more deaths because of the heat than the previous year.
It's actually estimated that that 20% excess mortality in real numbers meant the deaths of almost 3,000 people. These were, of course, vulnerable people, the elderly, the sick, the infirm, but it was categorically proven that the excess heat during this period brought their lives to a premature end.
Now again, that excess of death caused by the severe heat has been outdone many, many times now in later heat waves. And it just shows what more and more of this level of heat wave is going to do to the populations around the world, not just here, not just in Britain, but around the world. A lot of vulnerable people are very at risk when the temperature rises just a little.
For decades, every hot summer in Britain was compared with 1976. Then came the 21st century, the summer of 2003, the heat waves of 2018, the record-breaking temperatures of 2022, and now another prolonged spell of exceptionally hot weather. Once again, reservoir levels are falling. Once again, wildfires are breaking out across parts of Britain. Once again, hosepipe bans have become a familiar headline. The difference is that scientists now view these events through a very different lens. The Met Office notes that while weather patterns such as blocking high pressure have always occurred naturally, the background climate in which they now develop is warmer than it was in 1976. Now, what does that mean? Well, for us, that means that similar weather patterns today are capable of producing even higher temperatures. And of course, a far greater impact than they had 50 years ago. The challenge has changed from simply coping with a single extraordinary summer to adapting to the possibility that such extreme conditions will be becoming far more frequent. The question has quietly changed from could this be another 1976 to could we have another 1976 every year? And if we do, it's going to be even warmer.
And despite how much infrastructure and things like that might have improved since the 70s, I don't think it would take much. I mean, think about 1976, this was like 8-9 months with minimal rainfall, not a lot of water. I think if we experience that same thing now, and then add to that the higher temperatures that we experience now, I think we could find ourselves very quickly in an as bad or even possibly worse situation than we were back then. So was 1976 worse than the heat waves we currently experience? Yes, in a way, but it was more the lack of water for such a long period of time than the heat that was experienced. The heat we get now is way, way worse, and records have fallen again and again and again since 1976. But with that heat wave, it was the prolonged, extended nature of it on top of the just sheer lack of rainfall that made it so impactful and so dangerous. And then add that to the 70s infrastructure that was in place at the time, and you had a recipe for disaster. Now what we have to worry about is not necessarily the same kind of extended period of no water and high temperatures, but just the more frequent periods of incredibly high temperatures. What's the reason we remember 1976? It's because it was so out of left field. It was so rare, it was so unusual. That is the reason it has stayed so long in the memory and why every new heat wave gets compared to 1976, even though we've had far worse since then. But the truth of the matter is that we've just gotten way more used to it. And as bad as our infrastructure may be now, or we may think it is, it's better than it was in the 70s. So it's a lot more manageable when a heat wave does come along. But if 76 teaches us anything, it's that it doesn't take much to put all of this critical infrastructure into chaos. And so there's a good chance that 2026's equivalent of a 1976 heat wave would be far, far worse. Well, from here in Horton Kirby, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, then remember to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you were around in 1976 and you've got any memories from back then. Maybe you can tell us whether you were worried about it or whether you were celebrating it the entire time. And also let me know how you think it compares to modern heat waves, because I know what science tells us, and that's that, things are definitely going to get worse, and I'd be inclined to agree with scientists. But I know it can be a controversial topic, so let me know what you think. And on that note, I'll see you in the next one.